Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. Before we start discussing the current situation on the ground, I would like to remind you that today, the 11th of July, is the final day, the last day of the current NATO summit. And this is a very important piece of news because if you remember before the NATO summit, we were talking a lot about the changes on the ground, about possible changes on the ground during this period of time. And we discussed that most likely the Ukrainians would try to hold the line of combat contact until the end of the NATO summit, or at least they would not provide any updates or any information regarding any changes on the ground before the final day of the NATO summit. And today, for example, we got a very big batch of updates about the changes on the ground, and as I understand, most likely this situation is connected with the things that the main things were discussed during the NATO summit. The main agreements were signed by Zelensky. We have reports about F-16s, about many other different things. So that's why Zelensky probably sent an order to his forces, to his general, to begin withdrawing positions in the places where it's necessary. Now let's discuss this process. First, let's talk about Volchansk, because as for Liptsi, we haven't received lots of very interesting updates, but we got significant number of very interesting details about the area between Prylipka, Bugruvatka, Staritsa and Volchansk itself. As for the Russian foothold to the east of Bugruvatka, the Ukrainians, according to information we have, are regrouping right now, because during the previous attempts, most of their attempts were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians, it's very difficult to send here very armored vehicles, heavy weapon like tanks, armored vehicles, personal carriers, due to the forests and so on. So the Ukrainians are able to operate just with light infantry, and most of the Ukrainian attacks were repelled in the past. Now the Ukrainians are regrouping, and during the next few days, or maybe even today, the Ukrainians will make another attempt to attack the Russian positions on the line Prylipka, the Russian foothold, and the second line attack is going to take place between Staritsa and the Russian foothold with the purpose to cut the Russians on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donets river and to create a cauldron. Now let's move to Volchansk itself. We have a lot of very interesting updates. The Russians published another video how they managed to discover the temporary position of armed forces of Ukraine and to destroy this and to bomb this territory with aviation FAB-500. As for Volchansk itself, starting of yesterday's evening, we received significant number of updates about the current status in this territory. Some mappers have confirmed reports and information that the Russians managed to cross Vovchansk river and to establish complete control over some buildings, over the cemetery, and over some buildings along Priluzhnaya Street and Ivano-Franko Street. If you remember, yesterday we talked about the situation. First, we talked about the station 2 days ago, and we got reports about heavy clashes in this territory. Yesterday we discussed that according to some pro-Russian sources, the Russians managed to capture this college, and today some mappers confirmed that the Russians established complete control over the cemetery and some buildings along these streets. So as you can see, the Russians are expanding their foothold in this area, and this is very bad piece of news for the Ukrainians, because also starting off today, some pro-Russian sources began reporting that Ukrainians decided and began abandoning their positions in the north of Vovchansk towards more reliable positions in the forest to the south. So the Ukrainians, according to some pro-Russian sources, have already abandoned their positions from the citadel towards the residential area along the Vovchansk river, and those Ukrainians who were located along Vovchansk river abandoned their positions towards the forest. So the process, the battle, the end, let's say even the final page, even the final chapter of the battle for the north of Vovchansk has begun. Furthermore, some Russian sources reported that some Russian units across Vovchansk river and started offensive in direction of the railway station that located, let's say, in the western part of Vovchansk, and currently there are very heavy clashes in this area as well. I'll remind you that just yesterday we discussed the situation in this territory. I'll remind you once again that, for example, yesterday the Russian sources published significant number of videos of how they were bombing and attacking this territory with FAB-500, with Tostan and Tower systems. So most likely these attacks were something like artillery preparation, and after this pummeling of the territory, the Russians crossed the river and began clashes in this territory as well. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that maybe we are not just in the final chapter of the battle for the north of Vovchansk. Probably we reached the final page of the battle for the south of Vovchansk as well. Now let's move further. Let's talk about different Kupiansk directions. As you can see, in Kupiansk we have a lot of very big Russian artillery activity. The Russians are bombing according to configuration the main supply roads that Ukrainians are trying to use for regrouping and maybe for the attempts to counterattack the Russians in Pischana. Now let's move further. We have additional updates from the village of Makeivka. According to some Russian sources, during the previous night, the Russians managed to answer Makeivka itself and to capture a few more buildings along the main streets in this village. For now, we don't have 100% sure information about this. On the other hand, we received report. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russian forces in the vicinity of the most northern part of the village. In this video, we can see the Russian infantry that was moving towards this small block of Makeivka. So summarizing everything, the Russians were moving something like this, and the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians, and the geolocation we received was geolocated exactly in this intersection of the streets and the roads. Now let's move further. We got some updates from Verkhnykamianskaya direction. If you remember, this territory, this stronghold used to be, let's call it as is an uncontested area, because some Russian sources, including very reliable and neutral sources, reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory. But today, the forces of not 54th, but of 118th Territory Defense Brigade of Armed Forces of Ukraine published a very long video. 54th Brigade published a very long video up to 20-30 minutes of clashes on the battle for the stronghold that been taking place during previous few days. And the Russians were using a significant number of armored vehicles, personnel carriers. We will not watch the video due to the significant number of casualties among the Russian soldiers. So the Russians were attacking this stronghold from this area. The Russians were attacking the stronghold from this area. Lots of personnel carriers were destroyed. The Russians entered the trenches, but due to significant losses, those who managed to survive during those waves of attacks surrendered to the Ukrainians. So if you have access to the map, of course, you can take a look at this video. Very heavy clashes and lots of destroyed vehicles from the Russian side. So based on this video, we have returned control over this stronghold under complete Ukraine control. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Toretsk, New York agglomeration. The Ukrainians continue FPV droning the Russians in the central part of the Pivnichne. As you can see, we have significant number of geolocations that were published by the 95th Brigade, not just by the 95th, 32nd, and Lut. So these three brigades are the core of defense of armed forces of Ukraine in this area. And we have video confirming the line of combat contact. In this video, for example, we can see counterattack from the Ukrainian sources. They sent some personal care armored vehicle exactly along Gernitskaya Street, and the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians with a very short distance. This video confirms that's the presence of the Russian forces in this territory. Now let's move further. Let's talk about New York. The Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian positions, and according to this video, as you can see, the Russians began bombing the industrial zone, the core of defense of New York, the main citadel of New York, and if the citadel falls, the entire New York will fall automatically. So the Russians start bombing this territory, the most important part. As for changes on the ground, today we got additional reports. Neutral mappers confirmed additional Russian progress in Petrovska Gora. The Russians captured a small plant, small factory in this territory. Also, the sources reported, neutral sources report about additional Russian progress along these streets and this part of New York. So as you can see, the Russians are trying to improve their positions to the east, to the west, and to the north. And we have additional report from pro-Ukrainian mappers about Russian control over this tree line. So by this attack, the Russians are trying to encircle the Ukrainians who are currently located in this forest and this forest belt. Now let's move further. Let's talk about western Avdiivka direction. We have additional reports. The sources reported pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, and neutral that during the previous few days and starting of this morning, the Russians established complete control over the village of Yevgeniivka and Voshod. And the Russians are saying that most likely today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm this information, will provide additional updates during the Ministry of Defense report. As for Novoselovka Persha, the Russians managed to block the village from 2-3 sides, but for now without any changes and without any clashes on the ground. We have additional video in Karlovka water reserve in the northern part of Karlovka. The Russians, as you can see, are bombing the territory of that is under complete Ukrainian control, and this is like attempts to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory completely. Very interesting and very important updates are coming from Krasnohorivka. Once again, today is 11th of July, and we start receiving significant updates, which confirms that during the previous few days, the Ukrainians were just trying to hold the territory as long as possible. First, we got some changes on the ground according to different mappers, that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. The Russians captured completely the high-rise building area, the Krasnohorivka citadel. The Russians captured a school, college, and hospital. This hospital and the edge Russian forces were discovered exactly already in the north and in the north and western part of the village, so in the residential low-rise building area. And later we got geolocations that were published by 59th Brigade, which is responsible for defense of this territory, and how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians inside of the city. The one geolocation was discovered along Belinskova Street. The second geolocation was discovered in the vicinity of Zvodna Street, which confirms complete control, and that the Ukrainians control just around 20 or 25% of Krasnohorivka, which will be abandoned by the Ukrainians in the very near future as well. After a few waves of attacks towards Krasnohorivka, the Russians managed to discover the main Ukrainian artillery positions that were attacking the Russians during those offensives, and now the Russians start destroying these positions and preparing foothold before next attempts to attack. As for Velika Novoselovka, nothing special, the same story about Robotyne and Zaporozhye direction. And of course, don't forget that today we got lots of updates from the NATO countries, a lot of statements. We see the most important conclusion that we can make based on the reports of different NATO countries, that there is a conflict between the members of NATO countries, not between, let's say, Hungary and other, let's say, states, but we also see some conflict between Poland and NATO countries, because Poland is not going to take responsibility for itself when if Poland will bring down Russian missiles. Poland wants to NATO countries to be NATO organization to be responsible for destroying Russian missiles above the territory of Ukraine, and this is obviously not something that the United States of America and not NATO countries want to see from its ally. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.